The snow was 3 feet deep and still falling when the Whitaker family's roof gave way with a crack that echoed across the frozen valley. It was not the sound of a branch breaking or a tree falling in the wind. It was the sound of something built by human hands surrendering to a force that human hands could not control. The main ridge beam, a log that had been cut and shaped and lifted into place with pride and effort, and the belief that it would hold split through its center like a bone snapping under too much weight. Inside the cabin, Callum Strand heard the sound carry through the storm. He stood at his own window, frost creeping across the glass, and watched the dark shape of the Whitaker cabin right in the middle like a horse with a broken back. He saw the door fly open. He saw 4 figures stumble out into the blizzard, small against the wall of white, and he knew immediately that they would come to him because his cabin was closest. But he also knew something else. His cabin was running out of firewood. His walls were leaking cold air through gaps in the chinking, despite efforts to seal them. His family of 5 was already shivering under every blanket they owned. He looked toward the mountain. Somewhere up there, invisible in the storm, was the structure they had all mocked for 8 months. The hole in the ground. The grave the widow was digging for herself. The foolish project of a grief-stricken woman who did not know how things were done in this country. Callum Strand pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and stepped out into the worst blizzard he had ever seen. He climbed through waist-deep snow, through wind that tried to push him back down the slope, through cold that found every gap in his clothing and punished him for it. When he reached the door built into the hillside, he pounded on it with fists he could no longer feel. The door opened. Warm air poured out into the storm like breath from a living thing. Nettie Morley stood in the doorway firelight behind her and looked at the man who had told her 9 months ago that what she was building was not how cabins were constructed in this country. She said nothing. She stepped aside and let him in. 9 months earlier, the wagon came to a stop at the edge of the settlement on the morning of March 23, 1856. Nettie Morley sat on the driver's bench with the reins loose in her hands and studied the collection of log cabins scattered across the narrow valley. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played near one of the larger structures. A woman carried a bucket of water from a well. It looked like survival. It looked like community. It looked like everything Nettie had hoped to find when she and her husband had left Wisconsin 6 months before. She climbed down from the wagon. Her boots found the muddy ground, and the cold mountain air filled her lungs with something sharper than what she had breathed on the prairie. The dog jumped down beside her, a large Norwegian elk hound named Gunnar, who had walked beside the wagon for 300 miles without complaint. Together they stood in the early spring cold, while Nettie took inventory of what remained. 1 wagon, 2 oxen, a dog, her husband's tools, her grandmother's trunk, enough supplies to last perhaps 2 months if she was careful, and a piece of paper that said she owned 80 acres somewhere in these mountains, land purchased through a territorial agent in a St. Louis office that smelled of tobacco and broken promises. She noticed something as she studied the settlement. Every cabin looked the same. 4 walls of stacked logs, a pitched roof, a stone chimney. The same design repeated 8 times across the valley floor, as if one man had built the first and everyone else had simply copied it without asking whether it was the best way or merely the only way they knew. A man approached from the nearest cabin. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in wool and leather, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. He introduced himself as Callum Strand. "You're the widow," he said. "I am. Land office sent word you'd be coming. Your plot is 2 miles up the valley. Steep terrain, rocky soil. Good water, though." He studied her the way a man studies a problem he is not sure he wants to solve. You got family coming to help you build? No family. Hired men? No. Callum Strand's expression shifted to something between pity and genuine concern. Ma'am, this country doesn't forgive mistakes. Winter comes early, bears are active. You need shelter built before snow flies, and that's maybe 5 months if you're lucky. I understand. Do you know how to build a cabin? I've watched it done. Watching and doing are different things. He gestured toward the settlement. We help each other when we can. If you're willing to wait until summer, some of the men might have time to help you raise a cabin. Standard construction. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you alive. Nettie looked past him toward the mountains. She could see the valley rising into pine forest, the terrain growing steeper with elevation. Somewhere up there was her land. Appreciate the offer, she said, but I need to see the land first. Callum nodded. I'll ride up with you tomorrow, show you the boundaries. That night, Nettie camped beside her wagon at the edge of the settlement. She built a small fire and made coffee while Gunnar lay beside her, his warmth a comfort against the mountain cold. The settlement was quiet except for the occasional sound of a door closing or a dog barking in the distance. Above her, stars appeared in the darkening sky, more stars than she had seen since leaving Wisconsin, and the silence between them felt enormous. She thought about Ward. The memory came without invitation. Mid-January on the open prairie. They had been camped for 3 days while a winter storm passed. Ward lay in the back of the wagon, wrapped in every blanket they owned, coughing blood into a cloth he tried to hide from her. She knew he was dying. He knew she knew. They had stopped pretending otherwise weeks ago. On the 4th day, the storm broke and pale sunlight appeared. Ward asked her to help him sit up so he could see the sky. She propped him against the wagon side and sat beside him, holding his hand. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a small battle, but his mind was clear in a way it had not been for weeks. You're going to make it to the mountains, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. We're going to make it, Nettie replied, though they both knew the lie for what it was. Ward shook his head slightly. Listen to me. When you get there, don't build like everyone else builds. Don't just copy what you see. He paused to gather enough air for the next words. My father built the same barn 3 times because he built it the way his father taught him. Same mistakes, same failures, same stubborn pride. Promise me you'll think different. I promise. Build smart, Ward continued. Not just strong. Strong breaks when the wind is stronger. Smart adapts. Smart survives. He coughed a wet, terrible sound that came from deep inside his chest. Remember your grandfather's house in Norway. Remember how it worked with the land not against it. She wanted to tell him to save his strength, but she knew these might be his last coherent words to her, so she listened with everything she had. The earth protects what's inside it, he said. Stone holds heat. Water flows downhill. These things don't change. Use them. His grip on her hand tightened. Don't let anyone tell you there's only one way to survive. Promise me. I promise, Nettie said again. Ward died 2 days later. She buried him on a hillside overlooking a frozen creek using a pickaxe to break through the hard ground. It took her most of a day to dig deep enough. She marked the grave with stones and said the prayers her mother had taught her. Before she left, she placed one thing on the grave. Ward's small hammer, the first tool he had ever owned as a boy. She kept every other tool he had. Cheyenne. She would build with them, but this one was his alone. I'll build with your tools, she said to the stones, but this one you keep. Then she climbed back into the wagon and continued west. The fire was dying now, collapsing into coals. Nettie added another piece of wood and pulled her coat tighter. Gunner shifted beside her, his breathing steady and calm. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Tomorrow she would see her land. Tomorrow she would begin making decisions about how to survive. And when she did, she would remember Ward's words. She would build smart, not just strong. She would think different, even if it meant standing alone. Callum Strand guided his horse up the narrow trail the next morning with Nettie's wagon following behind. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed pine forest closing in on both sides. After an hour, they emerged into a clearing on a hillside that offered a view of the entire valley below. "This is it," Callum said, dismounting. "Your 80 acres runs from this ridgeline down to the creek. Mostly slope, as you can see. Not much flat ground for farming, but the water's reliable and you're high enough to avoid the spring flooding." Nettie climbed down from the wagon and walked the perimeter. The land was indeed steep, rising sharply toward a rocky outcrop on the eastern edge. But she saw possibilities that others would miss. The southern exposure would catch maximum sunlight through the winter months. The slope provided natural drainage that would keep water moving away from any structure rather than pulling against it. And the hillside itself was composed of firm soil and rock, not the loose scree or sandy earth that would crumble under pressure. She stopped at a spot where the hill formed a natural concave depression, almost like a shallow bowl carved into the slope by centuries of wind and water. The earth here was protected from the worst winds by the terrain above. She crouched and dug her fingers into the soil. Dense clay mixed with embedded stone. She squeezed it in her fist and watched it hold its shape. "What are you looking at?" Callum asked. "This spot," Nettie said. "This is where I'll build." Callum frowned and walked over. He studied the location and shook his head. "Ma'am, you want to build down near the creek on flat ground. This slope is too steep. You'll be hauling water uphill every day, and come winter snow will drift heavy right where you're standing." "I'll build into the hill," Nettie said. There was a long silence. Callum stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he did not understand. "You'll what?" "I'll excavate into the slope and build the structure partially underground. The earth will provide insulation and protection. I'll only need to construct the front wall and roof." Callum removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Ma'am, with all respect, that's not how cabins are built in this country. You build 4 walls and a roof on level ground. What you're describing sounds like a root cellar, not a home." "It's how my grandfather built in Norway," Nettie said calmly. "His house was set into a hillside overlooking a fjord. He lived there 40 years. The earth kept it warm in winter and cool in summer with barely any firewood at all. A meter of soil above your head acts as insulation that no amount of log chinking can match. The stone walls only need to hold back the earth and let in light. Everything else the mountain does for you." "This isn't Norway," Callum said. His tone had hardened. "The ground is different. The weather is different, and digging into a hillside alone is dangerous work. The whole thing could collapse on you." "I'll be careful." Callum replaced his hat and looked at her with something close to frustration. "Mrs. Morley, I'm trying to help you survive your first winter. What you're proposing is foolish and dangerous. Let us build you a proper cabin down by the creek. It won't cost you anything but time." "I appreciate your concern," Nettie said, "but this is my land and my decision." The ride back to the settlement was silent. By evening, the entire community knew about the widow's plan to dig a hole in the ground and live in it like an animal. 3 reactions followed in quick succession, and together they formed the wall that would surround Nettie Morley for the next 6 months. The first came on Sunday morning. Reverend Whit Pennock, a broad-shouldered man of 55 who had served as the settlement's spiritual authority for 7 years, stood before his congregation in the largest cabin and spoke with the grave certainty of someone who believed he was saving a life. Mrs. Morley has recently suffered a terrible loss, he said. Grief clouds judgment. We have all seen it, and I have seen in my years on this frontier what happens when grief drives a person to make decisions that this land will not forgive. We have a responsibility to guide her toward the right path before that hillside buries her. No one survives alone by ignoring the experience of those who came before. Pennock was not a cruel man. He had buried settlers who died from bad decisions, from cabins built in floodplains, from shelters too flimsy to withstand the first real storm. He genuinely believed Nettie would die if she followed through with her plan. But what he could not see, because he had never seen it done, was that Nettie was not acting from ignorance. She carried knowledge he did not possess. The second reaction came that same evening in the settlement's informal gathering place where Roscoe Wensley held court. Roscoe was 35, the best carpenter in the valley, a man who had built 3 of the settlement's 8 cabins with his own hands. His reputation was his identity. When he heard about the widow's plan, he took it as a personal insult. "I'll wager a month's provisions that hole collapses before the first snowfall," he announced to the men around him. "I've been building homes for people out here for 10 years. Earth doesn't bear load the way timber does. Any man here knows that." Dorrit Strand Callum's wife nodded vigorously from across the room. "Living underground like a prairie dog. It isn't natural." In the far corner of the room, Ansel Pollard, 20 years old and quiet by nature, listened to everything and said nothing. He did not agree with Roscoe, but he did not yet have the courage to say so. The third reaction happened privately. Rowena Pollard, Ansel's mother, pulled her son aside as they walked home. "Don't get involved with the widow's business," she said. "People will talk." But her voice lacked conviction, and when she glanced back toward Nettie's wagon at the edge of the settlement, her expression held something that looked less like disapproval and more like recognition. Nettie began work the next morning. She loaded the wagon with tools and supplies and drove the oxen up the trail. By mid-morning, she had established a camp near the spot she had chosen and stood before the hillside with her husband's pickaxe in her hands. The tools Ward had left her were basic but functional: a pickaxe, a shovel, a handsaw, a draw knife, a sledgehammer, and several iron wedges for splitting stone. It was enough to build with if she was smart about how she used each piece. She started by clearing vegetation from the depression. Small bushes and grass came away easily. Larger roots required the axe and patience. By afternoon, she had exposed the bare earth. She marked out the dimensions with stakes and rope. 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hill. The ceiling height would be 7 feet at the front. The excavation began with the pickaxe. Each swing loosened clay and stone. She shoveled the debris into a pile of material she would use later for mortar and other purposes. Her hands blistered within the first hour. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, but she maintained a steady rhythm, understanding that this was not a task to be rushed. By evening of the first day, she had excavated perhaps 2 feet into the hillside. It was slow progress, but it was progress. She built a fire, made dinner, and slept in the wagon with Gunner curled at her feet. The second day brought the same routine: pick, shovel, pile. Her hands bled through the blisters now, so she wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. Dawn until dusk. Alone. On the fourth day, the pickaxe struck something that would not move. A boulder. Buried deep in the clay, its surface barely visible, its mass extending far down into the earth. Nettie dug around its edges, trying to find where it ended. She pried with the pick, hammered with the sledge, worked from every angle. Nothing. The stone sat in the exact center of her excavation, like a fist pushed up from below, blocking everything. She lost half a day to the boulder. Then another half day. Her arms burned, Her back screamed. The stone did not care. Nettie sat down in the dirt. She leaned against the earthen wall she had carved over 4 days of brutal labor, her face streaked with mud, her hands raw, and felt the weight of solitude settle on her like something physical. Not the brave solitude of a woman with a mission, not the noble solitude of someone choosing an unconventional path. Just the empty, heavy silence of a person who has no one to call for help. She looked at Gunner. The dog looked back, head tilted slightly. "Ward," she said out loud, "am I being a fool?" The wind moved through the pine trees above. No answer came. The forest did not care about her question. The boulder did not care about her question. The settlement below, where 14 people had already decided she was wasting her time, did not care about her question. Nettie sat in that silence for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked to her tool pile and selected the iron wedges and the sledgehammer. She examined the boulder again this time, not with frustration, but with attention. She found a hairline crack running along one side, almost invisible, unless you were looking for exactly that kind of weakness. She placed the first wedge in the crack and struck it with the sledge. A small sound, metal on metal, echoed off the hillside. She placed a second wedge 2 inches from the first and struck again, then a third. It took the rest of the afternoon, but the boulder split into 4 pieces, each small enough to leave her out with a wooden pole. She dragged them to her stone pile, breathing hard, arms trembling. These pieces, the ones that had blocked her way, she set aside separately. She would use them later in the front wall. The thing that had tried to stop her would become part of what she was building. On the 7th day, she heard hoofbeats. Ansel Pollard rode up on a brown mare and sat in the saddle, looking down at the excavation, now perhaps 5 feet deep, and clearly taking shape as something intentional. "How steep is the ceiling angle?" he asked. No greeting, no small talk. A technical question from someone who had been thinking about this. Nettie looked up at him, surprised. She told him. He nodded, asked 2 more questions about the soil composition and the drainage pattern she was planning, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "I could help," he said. "I need to do this myself," Nettie replied. Ansel understood, but before he turned his horse to leave, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a coil of new rope. He tossed it down to her. "Your rope's about to snap," he said. "Third strand is fraying." He rode away. Nettie held the rope in her hands for a moment, a small thing, but it meant someone had been watching closely enough to notice what she needed before she asked. The rain started on the 9th day. It began as a drizzle at dawn and intensified through the morning until water fell in sheets across the mountainside. Nettie worked through it. Initially, her clothes soaked the excavation, turning muddy beneath her boots. But by midday, she noticed something that made her stop cold. Water was pooling at the back of her excavation. Not surface runoff from rain hitting the opening, but seepage coming through the earthen walls themselves. Small rivulets formed along the ceiling, dripping steadily into the space she had carved out over 9 days of brutal labor. The clay soil she had believed would be naturally waterproof was allowing groundwater to penetrate from the saturated slope above. If she continued without solving this, the finished structure would be permanently damp. Worse, the constant water flow could destabilize the earthen walls and cause a collapse. 9 days of work, the blisters, the bleeding hands, the boulder, the loneliness. All of it could disappear under a wall of wet clay. Nettie climbed out of the excavation and sat in the rain. Gunner sat beside her, wet and patient. She did not move for over an hour. The question she had asked Ward on the 4th day came back. "Am I being a fool?" Pennick's voice echoed behind it. Grief clouds judgment, then Roscoe's. That hole collapses before the first snowfall. She sat in the rain and let every doubt she had been carrying rise to the surface at once. Then she began to watch. Not the excavation, The hillside. She watched how water moved across the slope, where rivulets formed and where they didn't, which paths the runoff followed and which areas stayed relatively dry. She traced the natural drainage patterns with her eyes, following streams of water as they found the path of least resistance downhill. The solution emerged slowly. She needed to intercept the water before it reached her excavation. Channels dug into the slope above, angled to carry groundwater around the structure instead of through it. The next day dawned clear. Nettie began digging drainage trenches 30 feet uphill from her excavation, carving a shallow channel that ran diagonally across the slope. 8 inches deep, 12 inches wide, angled to direct water around both sides of her building site. She used a rope with a stone tied to one end as a crude level, checking constantly that the trench bottom maintained consistent downhill grade. After 2 days, she had completed a primary channel and 2 secondary branches. When the next rain came 3 days later, she stood in the doorway of her excavation and watched water flow obediently through her channels, curving around the structure and continuing downhill. The interior stayed dry. The earthen walls showed no new seepage. The problem was solved, but it had cost her nearly a week. Roscoe Wensley rode up to check on her during this time. He did not announce himself or ask permission. He simply appeared on horseback, looked down at the muddy trenches in the dark opening in the hillside, and studied the scene for perhaps 2 minutes. What he saw was chaos. Ditches full of mud, a hole in the ground, piles of wet earth. He did not stay long enough to see the drainage system work. He did not ask Nettie to explain what she was doing. He rode back to the settlement and reported what confirmed everything he already believed. "She's turning that hillside into a swamp," he told the men gathered at the store. "Give it another month, maybe less. The whole thing comes down." He was looking at the surface. He did not understand what was happening beneath it. And because he did not understand, he assumed there was nothing to understand. By late April, the excavation was complete. Nettie stood inside the hollow she had carved from the mountain and felt something she had not felt since Ward died. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable. Satisfaction. The space was 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, the ceiling holding its angle without cracks, the floor level thanks to careful attention with every shovelful removed. It was dark and cool, the earthen walls solid around her, not yet a home, but shelter of a kind. Gunnar walked in, sniffed each corner, methodically circled once and lay down. The dog had decided. This was acceptable. Nettie stood at the entrance and looked down at the valley. Smoke rose from the settlement chimneys. No one down there knew she had just finished the hardest part of the work. And the second hardest part, the stone wall. The waterproofing the roof was about to begin. Winter was still 5 months away, but 5 months was not as long as it sounded when you were building alone. She opened the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and wrote by the fading light. Excavation complete. Wall, roof, and winter still ahead. She closed the notebook. Gunnar shifted beside her. The pine trees moved in the evening wind. And somewhere below, the settlement carried on with its routines, unaware that the widow they had written off was exactly on schedule. The stone wall nearly killed her on a Tuesday in May. She had been stacking for 5 days, working from dawn until her arms refused to lift another piece. The bottom courses were solid, heavy granite blocks fitted tight against each other, with clay mortar packed into every gap. But by the 5th day, she was building at shoulder height, reaching up to place stones that weighed 30 and 40 pounds onto a surface she could barely see. She was tired. She was rushing. And she knew she was rushing, which made it worse because knowing a mistake is coming does not always stop you from making it. The stone she placed at the top of the 5th course was too heavy for the mortar beneath it to hold. She felt the shift before she heard it. a grinding sound, stone moving against stone, and then the top 2 feet of the wall collapsed outward in a cascade of rock and wet clay. Nettie jumped back, but not far enough. A piece of granite the size of a man's head struck her left shin and sent her to the ground. The pain was immediate and consuming. She lay in the dirt, gripping her leg, breathing through clenched teeth, waiting for the agony to settle into something she could think through. When it did, she ran her hands along the bone carefully. Not broken. She could feel the swelling beginning already, but the bone was intact. She would walk with a limp for weeks, but she would walk. She sat up and looked at the wall. 2 feet of work destroyed. Stones scattered across the ground in front of her, some cracked from the impact of falling. Mortar smeared everywhere like gray blood. A full day of labor undone because she had built too fast, stacking wet mortar before the lower courses had time to cure. Gunnar stood a few feet away, watching her with the patient concern of an animal that understands injury but cannot help with it. Nettie looked at the mess and said to the dog, "Ward told me to build smart. Today I built impatient." She spent the rest of that day sitting against a tree, her leg elevated on a log, studying the collapsed section from a distance. The lesson was clear: 2 feet of wall height per day, no more. Let each layer cure overnight before adding weight. Patience was not a virtue here. It was a structural requirement. She slept badly that night, her shin throbbing with each heartbeat. The next morning, she could barely put weight on the leg. She hobbled to the wall site and began clearing the fallen stones, sorting them again by size and shape, preparing to rebuild what she had lost. On the third day after the collapse, she heard footsteps on the trail below. Not hoofbeats this time, footsteps. Rowena Pollard appeared on the ridge carrying a basket covered with a cloth, walking with the steady pace of a woman who had climbed this trail before but never announced it. "My son says you're hurt," Rowena said, setting the basket down near the fire ring. Nettie straightened from where she'd been crouching by the wall, trying to hide the limp. "I'm fine." Rowena did not argue. She simply uncovered the basket, revealing bread, dried meat, a jar of preserved fruit, and a small tin of salve. "For your hands," she said, nodding toward the salve. Then she looked at Nettie's leg. "And for whatever you're pretending doesn't hurt." Nettie opened her mouth to refuse. Rowena was already walking toward the excavation opening, opening the entrance with the practical eye of a woman who had run a household for 25 years and knew the difference between something that worked and something that didn't. "Sit down," Rowena said. "I didn't climb up here for conversation. I climbed up here because you haven't eaten properly in 2 months, and my son is worried enough to mention it, and Ansel doesn't mention things unless they matter." Nettie sat. The relief of taking weight off her leg was so immediate that she could not pretend it didn't make a difference. Rowena handed her the salve and watched her apply it to her cracked, calloused hands without comment. They did not talk about construction. They talked about loss. Rowena had buried her first husband when she was 22. Fever took him in 3 days during a summer that should have been safe. She had been left alone on a homestead in Ohio with 60 acres and a baby and no family within 100 miles. "I know what you're proving up here," Rowena said, "and it isn't about the house." Nettie looked at her. "You're proving you aren't broken," Rowena continued, "that losing him didn't finish you, that you can stand up and build something with your own hands and it will hold." She paused. "I did the same thing. Different tools, same reason." It was the first time since Ward's death that someone had read Nettie correctly. Not as a foolish widow, not as a grief-maddened woman making dangerous choices, but as a person rebuilding herself one decision at a time, using the only method she knew. Rowena also brought a warning. "Whit Pennock has been speaking about you every Sunday. He tells the congregation you're an example of what pride does to a person, that you'll die up here, and it will be on the community's conscience for not stopping you." She looked Nettie in the eye. "And Roscoe Wensley tells anyone who'll listen that you're building your own grave. He says it like a joke, but people believe jokes when they're scared." "I can't control what they believe," Nettie said. "No, but you should know it's happening. You don't need to fight them, Nettie. You just need to outlast the winter. That's enough." Rowena stayed another hour, helped Nettie carry water from the creek below, and left without ceremony. She would return twice more in the weeks that followed, always with food, always with news from the settlement, never asking whether Nettie wanted company, simply providing it. The wall went back up slowly this time. 2 feet per day, no exceptions. Nettie spread mortar between each stone-tapped pieces into position with the handle of her axe checked for plumb with a weighted string. She had disassembled her original dry-stacked layout stone by stone, numbering each piece with chalk marks, and now rebuilt it identically with mortar. The process was tedious and exacting, but each course that survived the night gave her confidence in the one above it. By mid-May, the stone wall reached its full height, 7 feet at the center, tapering where it met the excavated hillside on either side. Door and window openings stood as dark rectangles framed by rough timber. Nettie walked the length of the wall, pressing her hands against the surface, feeling for any give or movement. The mortar had cured hard. The stones were locked together in a pattern that distributed weight evenly from top to bottom. She allowed herself one evening of rest. She sat by her fire and looked at what she had built so far. The dark mouth of the excavation behind the stone wall, the careful framework of the door and window. It was beginning to look like something intentional. The waterproofing and roofing consumed June and most of July. She harvested birch bark from trees along the creek, selecting large pieces from trunks at least 8 inches in diameter. She collected pine resin by making shallow cuts in pine trees and returning days later to gather the hardened sap. She heated the resin in an iron pot, added rendered animal fat and clay powder, stirred until the mixture reached the consistency of thick honey. This compound, sticky and difficult to work with, would serve as both adhesive and sealant. She applied it to the interior earthen walls, first spreading the compound to fill cracks and irregularities, then pressing birch bark sheets against it in overlapping layers. The ceiling was worse. Working overhead for hours, arms burning warm resin, dripping onto her face and into her hair. But she moved methodically, section by section, sealing the excavation in a continuous waterproof membrane. The roof beams came next, 6 main timbers, each 16 feet long, cut from straight pines on her property. She felled each tree, lammed it, and dragged it uphill using the oxen. The first beam was too heavy to lift alone. She built a ramp from smaller logs, rolled the beam up, while pulling from above with rope looped over an anchor point. It took most of an afternoon. The remaining beams went faster as she refined the technique. Cross supports laid across the main beams. Rough planks split from smaller logs overlapped like shingles. Birch bark over the planking, sealed at every seam with her resin compound. Then a 6-inch layer of clay and sand mixture worked smooth by hand. And finally the living layer. Sod cut from a nearby meadow, each piece roughly a foot square, roots and soil intact laid over the clay like puzzle pieces. The grass was still green, still growing. If maintained, it would continue to grow, binding the roof together with its roots. The weight was enormous, but the stone wall held it from the front and the earthen hillside absorbed it from behind. When she placed the last piece of sod, Nettie climbed down and stood 30 feet away. The structure had disappeared into the hillside. The living roof blended with the slope above. Only the stone face and the dark openings of the door and window revealed that human hands had built anything here at all. She walked to the stone wall and placed both palms flat against it, solid, steady, hers. And then she did something she had not done since the day she buried Ward. She cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, from the simple, overwhelming relief of having kept a promise. Nettie moved into the completed structure on a cool morning in late September. She carried her possessions inside one load at a time. Her grandmother's trunk against the east wall, the sleeping platform she had built from poles and rope raised off the ground to catch warmth from the hearth, a table and chair, shelves mounted to the wall, studs for food and cooking implements, a hearth built from stones in the far corner, its chimney exiting through a carefully waterproofed opening in the roof. The first night, she built a small fire and made dinner. She sat at her table and ate slowly, listening. Wind moved through pine trees outside, but inside the air was perfectly still. The thick walls muffled everything. The space felt enclosed and protected in a way that no cabin with 4 thin walls and cracks in the chinking could match. After dinner, she opened her grandmother's trunk and removed the last thing she had kept of Ward's. A cotton shirt worn soft from years of use, still carrying the faint trace of him. She folded it carefully and placed it under her pillow. Then she sat at her table again, opened her notebook, and wrote 3 lines. First night in my own home. Warm, quiet. You were right, Ward. Callum Strand appeared in early October. He said he was checking on her welfare. Nettie suspected curiosity had finally outweighed pride, though she did not say so. She invited him inside. She watched the change happen in real time. Callum stepped through the doorway and stopped. His expression moved from polite skepticism to confusion to something he could not quite hide. He walked the perimeter without speaking, touching the walls, studying the ceiling, examining the hearth. He stood in the center of the room for a long moment, feeling what he was feeling, trying to reconcile it with everything he believed about how shelter was supposed to work. It's warmer than my cabin, he said. The words seemed to cost him something. How much wood are you burning? Very little, Nettie said. Callum asked no more questions. He left shortly after, and on the trail back to the settlement, he stopped once. He stood still in the middle of the path and looked back up the hillside toward the structure that was no longer visible from below. He stood there for perhaps a minute, wrestling with something private. Then he continued walking. He did not tell Dorrit about the visit. Nettie settled into a routine as autumn deepened toward winter. She learned the rhythms of her home the way a sailor learns a ship. A fire built in the morning and fed modestly through the day kept the interior comfortable. At night, she banked the coals and the warmth held until dawn. Her firewood consumption was a fraction of what she had anticipated. November arrived with the first real snow. Nettie watched from her doorway as the valley below turned white, then closed her door and went about her evening. Her water bucket sat near the hearth unfrozen. Her food stores were adequate. Her structure was sound. Winter was here, and she was ready for it. Down in the settlement, the mood was different. Families fed their fireplaces constantly and still felt the cold creeping through log walls. Buckets froze overnight. Children slept in their coats. The wood piles that had seemed generous in October looked inadequate by November's end. Nobody connected this to anything Nettie had built because nobody wanted to think about what that connection might mean. Roscoe Winsley maintained his position. One evening in late November, surrounded by neighbors at the general store, he said what he had been saying since spring. Warm now, maybe, but wait for real winter. Wait for the heavy snow. That dirt roof can't hold what's coming. Timber holds load. Earth doesn't. He said it with the confidence of a man whose identity depended on being right about how things were built. Several people nodded. It was easier to agree with Roscoe than to consider the alternative. In the second week of December, old Thaddeus Caldwell made his rounds. Thaddeus was 73, a German immigrant who had survived 12 winters in this territory and predicted weather by reading signs that most people had forgotten how to see. He visited each cabin and delivered the same message: the thickness of bark on the aspens, the depth at which squirrels had buried their stores, the patterns of wind over the past 3 weeks. Everything pointed to a storm unlike anything this settlement had experienced, possibly before Christmas. Callum Strand took the warning seriously. He organized a meeting in his cabin, and 14 adults crowded inside. They reviewed each family's supplies. The inventory was concerning. Several families were already burning wood faster than they had planned. Brogan Whitaker's cabin, built hastily the previous summer, had a roof that was already creaking under the existing snow. The Peterson cabin had gaps in the chinking that let wind whistle through day and night. Someone mentioned that the widow up the hill seemed to be managing well with very little firewood. Dorrit Strand snorted. She's probably freezing and too proud to admit she made a mistake. Several women agreed. No one proposed riding up to check. The meeting ended with a plan to cut and haul more wood, inventory food more carefully, and keep children close to home. December 18th dawned under a sky that Nettie recognized. A yellowish-gray ceiling, heavy and low, pressing down on the valley like the lid of a box being slowly closed. The wind shifted from west to north. The birds that had been active around her property for months disappeared entirely. The forest went silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if every living thing had received the same warning at the same time and responded by going still. Nettie spent the day preparing. She brought in extra firewood, filling the space beside the hearth with enough for 10 days. She checked her food supplies. She cleared ice from her drainage channels. She barred the window shutter and reinforced the door frame with a wooden brace she had built for exactly this purpose. That evening, she sat by the fire with Gunnar at her feet and thought about the families in the settlement below. The Whitaker children, the Strand children, the Peterson children. She thought about walking down to warn them, to tell them what the sky was saying in a language she had learned as a child in Norway. Then she thought about what would happen if she did. Pennock would use it as proof that she was desperate for attention. Roscoe would mock her. Dorrit would roll her eyes. And if the storm did not come or came mild, Nettie would become the hysterical widow who cried wolf, and whatever small credibility she had built would vanish. But there was a deeper truth, and she forced herself to face it. She had spent 6 months being ignored. 6 months of "that's not how we do things." 6 months of being told she was wrong by people who had never once asked her to explain why she might be right. If she went down now and they laughed at her, she could survive the humiliation. But if she went down and they simply did not listen the way they had not listened about anything since the day she arrived, then she would have risked everything for nothing. She stayed. She did not feel good about it, but she stayed. The first flakes began to fall at dusk. By the time Nettie went to sleep, the snow was coming down steadily, the kind of snow that meant business heavy and relentless, and driven by a wind that was still gathering its strength. She woke on the morning of December 19th to a world that had changed overnight. Visibility was perhaps 20 feet. The wind had risen from a murmur to a roar, driving snow horizontally across the mountainside. By midday, it was a full blizzard. The temperature dropped through the afternoon like something falling off a shelf, fast and irreversible. Nettie stood at her doorway, briefly observing. Snow streamed past the opening in horizontal sheets. The sound was enormous outside, a howling, grinding pressure of wind and ice that seemed to have no gaps in it. She closed the door, barred it, and stepped back into silence. The contrast was so complete, it felt like entering a different world. The storm raged a few feet away, but inside her home, the air was still. The fire crackled softly. Gunnar lay by the hearth undisturbed. Nettie sat at her table, opened her book, and read by candlelight, while the worst storm in the valley's memory tried to tear the mountain apart around her. In the settlement below, conditions were already deteriorating. Callum Strand's cabin groaned under wind gusts. Cold air penetrated through gaps in the chinking, no matter how many rags Dorrit stuffed into them. Callum fed the fireplace constantly, log after log, and still the cabin felt cold enough that the children huddled together under blankets rather than moving freely around the room. The Whitaker cabin was worse. Brogan Whitaker had built it the previous summer with speed rather than durability in mind, using undersized beams and minimal bracing. The roof timbers had been creaking under normal snow loads for weeks. Now, with the blizzard piling weight faster than anything he had designed for the creaking, became constant. Brogan stood beneath the ridge beam and looked up at the ceiling, watching for any sign of flexion, listening for the particular sound that would mean the difference between shelter and catastrophe. Anna Peterson spent hours trying to seal the gaps in her cabin walls, stuffing rags and pressing mud into cracks that let snow blow through and form small drifts on the cabin floor. In the freezing temperature, nothing adhered. The mud froze before it could bind. The rags blew loose. Her children sat on the bed with their feet pulled up, watching their mother fight a battle she was losing by inches. The second day was worse. The wind intensified. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees into a range where exposed skin became dangerous within minutes. Men ventured outside, only to retrieve firewood from piles that were rapidly shrinking, and even those brief trips left them gasping and stiff. Firewood consumption accelerated as every family tried to fight back the cold with the only weapon they had. Callum Strand stood by his woodpile on the evening of the second day and counted what was left. The number he arrived at did not match the number of days the storm might last. He looked at his wife, at his 3 children, at the 4 Whitakers, who had not yet arrived but soon would, and he began to understand that he was facing a kind of arithmetic that had no good solution. Inside her Hillside home, Nettie maintained her normal routine. She cooked meals, she read, she mended a tear in her coat, she added wood to her fire 3 times during the day, modest amounts that kept the space comfortable without waste. The storm was happening, but it was happening to someone else's world. On the evening of the second day, she heard a sound that did not belong to the wind. Distant but distinct. A sharp crack like a rifle shot carried across the frozen valley on the storm's own breath. Nettie set down her book and listened. Gunnar raised his head. The sound did not come again, but it did not need to. She knew what it was. Somewhere below, something built by human hands had just failed. She stood and walked to the door. She placed her palm flat against the heavy timber. On the other side, a blizzard that would kill her in minutes. On this side, warmth and silence, and the structure she had carved from the mountain with her own bleeding hands. She did not open the door, not yet, but she knew with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone that someone would be coming up that hill before the storm was over. The Whitaker cabin roof failed at approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of December 20th, 1856. The main ridge beam, a log that Brogan Whitaker had cut and notched and lifted into place 5 months earlier, with the help of 2 neighbors and the private belief that it was strong enough, cracked through its center with a sound that carried across the frozen valley despite the storm. The crack traveled the full length of the beam in less than a second. The roof sagged inward, then the center section dropped into the cabin's interior, bringing with it 200 pounds of accumulated snow that exploded across the floor in a burst of white. Brogan had been watching the ceiling for hours. When the crack sounded, he moved before thought could slow him down. He grabbed his wife Corabeth with one arm, shoved his older boy toward the door with the other, and screamed for everyone to get out. They evacuated into the blizzard wearing whatever they had on. No coats gathered from hooks, no blankets pulled from beds, no food grabbed from shelves. Just four human beings in house clothes stepping from failed shelter into killing cold. The youngest Whitaker child, a 4-year-old girl named Ivy, was holding her mother's hand when they came through the door. The wind hit them like a wall. Corbeth staggered and the child's small fingers slipped free. Ivy fell forward into snow that swallowed her up to the chest, and the wind drove her sideways before Corbeth could react. 3 seconds. That was all it took for the child to become invisible in the white. Brogan heard Corbeth scream the girl's name. He turned back, lunging into the snow where he thought the child had fallen. His hands found nothing. He crawled forward, sweeping his arms through the drifts, calling Ivy's name in a wind that threw the sound back in his face. 10 feet from the cabin door, his right hand touched something soft. Fabric. He closed his fist around it and pulled, and Ivy came up out of the snow, like something being born, her face white, her lips already blue, her small body shaking with a violence that frightened him more than the collapsed roof. He held her against his chest and ran. The Strand cabin was 200 yards away. He could see the faint glow of firelight through one window, barely visible through the driving snow. Corbeth took the older boy's hand and followed. They arrived at Callum's door near collapse, all four of them soaked and shaking so hard they could not speak. Callum pulled them inside. Dorrit wrapped blankets around the children and put them near the fire. Corbeth's hands were white and waxy at the fingertips. Dorrit worked them gently between her own, trying to restore circulation. Ivy coughed and shivered and clung to her father's neck with a grip that would leave bruises. 7 people now occupied a cabin built for 3. Callum fed the fire and did not look at his woodpile. He already knew the number. He had counted that evening. What had been a concerning calculation for 5 people became a desperate one for 7. Across the settlement, Roscoe Wensley was fighting his own battle. The north wall of his cabin, the one that faced directly into the storm's teeth, had begun to lean inward sometime during the night. Roscoe noticed it first as a change in the sound, a low groaning that pulsed with each wind gust, as if the wall were breathing. He put his hand against the logs and felt them shift. Not much, a 1/4 inch, maybe less. But walls were not supposed to move at all. He braced a heavy timber against the leaning wall and pressed his shoulder into it. The cold came through the logs and into his body. He could feel the wind trying to push the wall down, and he could feel himself pushing back, and he understood with absolute clarity that this contest would eventually have a winner, and it would not be him. Roscoe Wensley had built this cabin. He had selected the logs, notched the corners, raised the walls, and shingled the roof. He had done everything the way he had always done it, the way every competent builder in this territory did it, and now his own work was failing around him, while somewhere up on that hillside, a structure built by a widow with a pickaxe sat inside the mountain itself, untouchable by any wind that had ever blown. He did not say this thought out loud. He did not need to. The wall said it for him every time it groaned. The storm continued through the 3rd day without mercy. Temperature held at levels that made every breath outside feel like inhaling broken glass. Snow accumulated at a rate that buried fences and erased trails and turned the valley into a featureless, white plain where direction became meaningless. Callum Strand made his decision on the evening of December 21st. He had spent the day feeding firewood into a fireplace that consumed it the way a furnace consumes coal constantly and without gratitude. His children were cold despite the fire. The Whitaker children were worse. Ivy had developed a cough that deepened through the day, and her small body radiated heat in a way that suggested fever rather than warmth. Corbeth sat beside her daughter and did not move, watching the child's breathing with the focused attention of a mother who has already calculated the worst outcome and is waiting to see if it arrives. Callum put on every piece of warm clothing he owned. He told Dorrit he was going to check on something. She looked at him with an expression that has said she knew exactly where he was going and what it meant that he was going there, and she did not stop him. 6 months of certainty about the widow's foolishness had collided with 3 days of reality, and reality had won. The climb up the hillside was the hardest physical experience of Callum Strand's life. Snow reached his chest in the drifts. Wind hit him from the side and nearly put him down twice. The cold found every gap in his clothing and punished the skin beneath. He could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. He navigated by memory and by the slope of the ground beneath his boots, climbing because up was the only direction that mattered. Halfway up, he fell, face down in the snow, the cold pressing against his cheeks, the wind howling above him like something alive and hostile. He lay there for several seconds, and in those seconds, he thought about his children and about the Whitaker girl coughing in his cabin and about the number of logs remaining in his woodpile. Then he pushed himself up and kept climbing. He reached the door and pounded on it with fists that had lost most of their feeling. Nettie opened it. She pulled him inside, closed the door against the wind, and guided him to a spot near the fire. Gunnar raised his head, assessed the visitor, and lowered it again. Callum stood shaking for several minutes before his jaw unlocked enough to form words. He looked around the interior. He had been here once before in October, and he remembered the warmth. But memory had not prepared him for the contrast between what existed on this side of the door and what existed on the other. Out there was death. In here was a room where a woman and a dog had been spending the evening in comfort. "The Whitaker cabin roof collapsed," he said when he could speak. "They're staying with us. We're burning through firewood too fast. Everyone is." He stopped. The next words required him to cross a line he had drawn for himself 9 months ago when he had told this woman that what she was building was not how things were done. "We need help." Nettie handed him a cup of hot tea. She waited for him to drink. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "How many people need shelter?" "The Whitakers are 4. My family is 5. The Petersons' cabin is barely holding. That's 4 more. Maybe others." 13 people, Nettie said. She looked around the space, calculating. "We can fit that many if we organize it properly. But I need supplies brought up. Food, blankets, whatever people have. And it needs to happen before anyone gets too weak from the cold to make the climb." Callum nodded. He understood what was happening. The woman whose choices he had questioned, whose methods he had dismissed, whose judgment he had doubted from the first day he met her, was now the only person in the valley with shelter that worked. And she was not making him ask twice. "Come whenever you need to," Nettie said. "The door will be open." Callum made the brutal journey back down to the settlement. He gathered the families in his cabin that night and explained the situation plainly. The response was not unanimous. Dorrit spoke first. "I am not living underground." Reverend Whit Pennock, who had come from his own cabin to attend the meeting, spoke second. "We should stay together here. This is our community. Running up the mountain to hide in a hole is not how we face adversity." Brogan Whitaker stood up from the floor where he had been sitting with Ivy in his arms. The child was sleeping fitfully, her breathing rough, her forehead hot. Brogan looked at Pennock with an expression that contained no deference and no patience. "My daughter almost died last night," he said. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. "She's sick now because she spent 30 seconds in that storm wearing nothing but a nightdress. If the widow's home is warm, that is where my family is going tomorrow morning. You want to freeze down here on principle, Reverend, that is your choice. But do not make that choice for my children." The room went silent. Pennock opened his mouth and closed it again. He had no answer for a man holding a sick child. Theology does not warm small bodies. Rowena Pollard spoke from the back of the room. "I've been up there. The structure is dry, it's warm, and it's stronger than any cabin in this settlement. I know that's hard to hear, but our children matter more than our opinions." Dorrit looked at Callum. Callum looked at the floor, then at his children, then at Dorrit. "We go tomorrow morning," he said. Roscoe Wensley sat in the corner through the entire argument without saying a word. He stared at his hands, the big, calloused hands that had built 3 cabins in this valley, and he did not look up. 9 people made the climb on the morning of December 22nd. They carried what they could manage. Children were wrapped in blankets and held in adults' arms. The trail that normally took 15 minutes required nearly an hour in the deep snow and driving wind. Halfway up, Dorrit Strand lost her footing on a buried rock and slid sideways down the slope. She grabbed at the snow, at air, at nothing, and began to tumble. Ansel Pollard, who had joined the group without being asked, threw himself down the slope after her. He caught her arm 10 feet below the trail and hauled her back up, both of them, gasping, covered in snow, their faces raw from cold. Dorrit looked at the young man who had just saved her from a fall that could have broken bones or worse. The young man she had agreed should stay away from the widow. The young man whose visits to Nettie's homestead she had called inappropriate and foolish. She looked at him and could not find a single word to say. They reached the door. Nettie opened it. Warmth met cold. The families poured inside and felt the difference register in their bodies immediately. Not as a gradual warming, but as a sudden presence, like stepping from a dark room into sunlight. Pennock did not come. He stayed in his own cabin alone with his convictions and his dwindling woodpile. Nettie organized the space with the same methodical precision she had used to build it. Sleeping areas along the walls. Central floor space kept open for movement. Children near the hearth at all times. Food supplies inventoried and portions calculated. A rotation for cooking, for tending the fire, for managing the necessary trips outside. 13 people in 192 square feet. It should have been miserable. It was not. The space was warm enough that people shed outer layers for the first time in weeks. Children who had been huddled and silent in the settlement cabins began to move to whisper to play quiet games on the packed earth floor. Ivy Whitaker's cough, which had worsened through the night in the Strand cabin, began to ease in the stable warmth. Corbeth held her daughter and watched the child's breathing slowly steady, and something in Corbeth's face released a tension she had been carrying since the roof fell. Dorrit Strand lay awake that first night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She watched Nettie add a small amount of wood to the fire. It was an amount that Dorrit would have considered worthless in her own cabin, barely enough to produce a flame worth looking at. But the warmth in the room did not diminish. Dorrit reached down and touched the packed earth floor beneath her blanket. Warm. She touched the wooden wall behind her head. Warm. Everything around her was holding heat that should have dissipated hours ago, and it was doing so without effort, without fuel, without anything she could see or name. She turned her face toward the wall so nobody would see that her eyes were wet. She was not crying from gratitude or relief. She was crying from shame. She had called this place unnatural. She had called the woman who built it foolish. She had said these things publicly with confidence, and she had been wrong about every word. Roscoe Wensley arrived on the second day. He appeared at the door alone, his beard thick with ice, his eyes fixed on the ground. The north wall of his cabin had finally given way sometime in the night. He had held it as long as he could shoulder, braced against the timber, muscles burning, until the wind delivered a gust that moved the wall 3 inches inward, and he understood that the next gust would bring it down on top of him. Nettie opened the door. She did not ask what had happened. She did not remind him of his wager. She did not say a single word. She simply stepped aside the same motion she had made for Callum and let him enter. Roscoe walked into the structure he had mocked for 8 months. He looked at the stone wall he had said would fail. He looked at the earthen ceiling he had said would collapse. He looked at the roof he had sworn could not hold a real snow load. 15 people sat or lay around the room in relative comfort, while outside the storm that had broken his own cabin continued its assault on the valley. He sat down in the far corner, as far from Nettie as the space allowed, and said nothing. Nettie brought him hot tea. He took it without meeting her eyes. Ansel went down to check on the remaining families the next morning and found Reverend Pennock sitting alone in a cabin where the fire had burned down to coals and the wood pile held perhaps half a day's supply. Pennock was wrapped in every blanket he owned and still shivering. His lips had a bluish tint. His hands, when Ansel took them, were cold enough to alarm. "Can you walk?" Ansel asked. Pennock looked at him. "Where?" "Up the hill." Something moved behind Pennock's eyes. Pride, maybe, or the memory of every Sunday sermon where he had warned the congregation about the widow's arrogance. Or perhaps just the simple recognition that dying alone in a cold cabin to prove a point was not the kind of death that proved anything at all. "I can walk," he said. Ansel half carried the older man up the hillside. Pennock leaned on him the entire way, his weight heavy, his breathing labored. The young man whose judgment he had questioned, supporting the body whose convictions had been wrong. Nettie opened the door. Pennock stepped inside. 16 people now in a space built for one. He stood near the entrance and looked around at everything he had predicted would fail. The ceiling that had not collapsed. The walls that were not damp. The families that were warm and alive because a woman he had publicly doubted had built something he did not understand and opened her door to people who had not earned her generosity. He looked at Nettie. The moment stretched. Everyone in the room felt its weight. "I was wrong," Pennock said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "About this house and about you." Nettie met his eyes. "Sit down, Reverend. There's hot tea." She poured him a cup and placed it in his hands. He wrapped his fingers around it and held on as if it were the most valuable thing he had ever been given. There was no lecture, no recrimination, no moment of triumph. Just a woman handing a cup of tea to a cold man and asking nothing in return. The storm broke on Christmas Eve. The wind died, first dropping away in stages like a fever breaking, and then the snow stopped and the sky cleared to reveal stars and a partial moon. The temperature remained brutal, but the assault was over. The valley lay under a blanket of white so deep in uniform that familiar landmarks had disappeared. Nettie stood at her doorway. Callum came and stood beside her. Below them, thin columns of smoke rose from the settlement cabins, where the remaining families had survived barely through careful rationing and shared body heat. The snow covering was so thick that some of the smaller structures were visible only as mounds with chimneys poking through. "We would have lost people," Callum said quietly. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the valley, at the cabins he had helped build, at the world he had helped create, according to principles that had nearly killed the people he loved. "If you hadn't opened your door, we would have lost people." Nettie said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had built this structure to survive. That others had survived because of it was not heroism. It was simply what neighbors did for neighbors, even neighbors who had not been neighborly. Inside, the children slept. Ivy Whitaker lay curled against Gunner's side, one small hand buried in the dog's thick fur, breathing evenly for the first time in days. The dog had not moved from the child's side since the Wheelers arrived, as if he understood that this small person needed warmth and comfort more than anyone else in the room. Dorrit Strand watched the sleeping child and the dog. Then she turned to Nettie, who had come back inside and was banking the fire for the night. "Thank you," Dorrit said. 2 words. But they were 2 words Dorrit Strand had never said to Nettie Morley, and they carried the weight of every word she wished she could take back. Spring came to the valley in late March of 1857. Snow melted in the warming sun. Creeks swelled with runoff. The settlement families emerged from their various shelters and assessed what winter had done to their community. The Whitaker cabin required complete reconstruction. The Peterson cabin needed a new north wall and extensive repair to the chinking on every remaining wall. Roscoe Wensley's cabin was a total loss, the north wall having pulled the adjoining corner with it when it fell, leaving a structure that was more wreckage than building. Several other cabins showed damage from snow-load ice or simple structural inadequacy revealed by conditions they had never been designed to face. Callum Strand called a community meeting in early April. He stood before his neighbors and spoke the kind of truth that costs a man something to say. "We survived the worst winter any of us have seen," he said. "But we survived it because one person in this valley built something the rest of us said was wrong. I was one of the people who said it. I was wrong, we all were." He paused and let that settle. Standard construction worked fine for the winters we expected. It failed for the winter we got. If we keep building the same way, the next bad winter will finish what this one started. Brogan Whitaker stood up. "My family is rebuilding," he said, "and we're building it to the hillside where the terrain allows. I've seen what it does. I spent 3 days inside it with my children. I don't need more convincing than that." Ansel Pollard announced he would build his own home using Nettie's methods. He asked if she would advise him during construction. Nettie agreed. The meeting adjourned. People filed out into the spring sunshine talking about drainage channels and stone walls and earth roofs, vocabulary that would have drawn laughter 6 months earlier and now drew serious discussion. Roscoe Wensley did not speak at the meeting. He waited until the crowd dispersed, then walked up the trail to Nettie's homestead alone. He found her outside clearing debris from her drainage channels after the snow melt. He stood 10 feet away, his hat in his hands, and looked at the structure he had wagered would collapse. The sod roof was greening up with new spring growth. The stone wall stood plumb and solid after bearing the worst winter load the valley had ever produced. Not a crack, not a sea, not a single stone out of place. "I built 3 cabins in this valley," Roscoe said. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man who has thought about what he wants to say for a very long time. "I built them the way I was taught, the way my father built, the way everyone builds." He stopped. "All 3 failed this winter. Every one." Nettie set down her shovel and looked at him. She did not help him with what came next. He had to get there on his own. "You built one structure," Roscoe continued, "alone with hand tools, and it held 16 people through the worst storm I've ever seen." He swallowed. "Teach me." Nettie studied the man who had bet a month's provisions that her home would collapse, who had told everyone in the settlement that she was building her own grave, who had ridden up to her homestead during construction and reported back that she was turning the hillside into a swamp. She looked at him, standing there with his hat in his hands and his pride on the ground at his feet, and she made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with what Ward had asked her to build. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "be here at first light. Bring a pickaxe." Roscoe nodded once. He put his hat back on and walked down the trail. Nettie watched him go, then picked up her shovel and went back to work on the drainage channels. Through the spring and summer of 1857, three new hillside structures rose in the valley. Ansel Pollard completed his first working under Nettie's guidance, finishing in late June. The Whitakers partially embedded their new home into a small slope near their original site. A family named Johnson new arrivals, who had heard the story of the previous winter from every person they met, built entirely into a hillside on the western edge of the settlement. Roscoe Wensley spent 3 months learning. He arrived at Nettie's homestead at dawn, asked questions, listened to answers, and applied what he learned with the skill and precision that had always made him good at building things. The difference now was that he was building things that work with the land instead of standing against it. His hands trained for timber, and Saul learned to read soil and stone. His eyes, accustomed to plumb lines and square corners, learned to see the angles that a hillside offered naturally. By autumn, Roscoe was advising other builders. He never took full credit. When someone asked where he had learned these techniques, he said the same thing every time. "The widow taught me." He said it without embarrassment because the truth had burned the embarrassment out of him during 3 days of holding up a wall that should never have needed holding. Dorrit Strand became the method's most vocal advocate, which surprised everyone, including Dorrit. She spoke to new settlers about the winter of 1856 with the particular authority of a person who has been completely wrong about something and lived to understand why. "I called it unnatural," she would tell newcomers. "I called the woman who built it foolish. And then I spent 3 nights inside that home while my own cabin leaked cold air through every crack, and I learned the difference between what I believed and what was true." Her endorsement carried weight precisely because it came from a woman who had once opposed the very thing she now championed. Travelers passing through the valley carried the ideas outward. By 1860, variations of earth-sheltered construction appeared throughout the Montana Territory. Some builders incorporated partial hillside integration. Others attempted full replication of Nettie's methods. The results varied with individual skill and understanding, but the underlying principle that Earth was an ally rather than an obstacle became accepted practice across a region that had once built every structure the same way without questioning why. Nettie married Ansel Pollard in the spring of 1859. The ceremony was small, held outside her hillside home on a warm May afternoon, with Gunner lying in the doorway as if standing guard over the occasion. Callum Strand attended. Dorrit attended. Rowena Pollard, who had climbed the hill with food and medicine when no one else would, stood beside her son and watched him marry the woman she had recognized from the very beginning as someone who was not broken. Pennick attended too. He offered a blessing that contained no conditions and no reservations. He had rebuilt something of his own that winter, not a structure, but an understanding. He never again spoke about another person's choices with the certainty he had once carried so easily. They raised 2 children in the home Nettie had built alone. The structure required minimal maintenance over the decades that followed. The sod roof needed occasional reseeding. The drainage channels required clearing after heavy storms. The stone wall weathered but held. The fundamental engineering, the relationship between earth and stone and timber that Nettie had designed based on her grandfather's knowledge and her own hard-won understanding, remained sound year after year. On a summer afternoon when her daughter was 7 years old, Nettie took the girl on a walk around the property. She showed her the drainage channels and let her trace the path water took around the structure. She showed her the stone wall and let her run her fingers across the rough surface. She pointed out where the roof met the hillside and how grass grew across the seams so seamlessly that the mountain seemed to swallow the house and hold it safe. "The earth protects what's inside it," Nettie said. Her daughter looked up at her with wide ease. She touched the stone wall with both hands, palms flat, feeling the warmth that radiated from within. She did not understand the engineering. She did not need to. She understood that her mother had built something that lasted and that the knowledge of how to build it was passing from one pair of hands to the next, the way it always had, the way it always would. Nettie Morley Pollard died in the winter of 1880 at the age of 51. Pneumonia took her quickly 3 days from first cough to last breath, far faster than the consumption that had taken Ward on the Prairie 24 years earlier. She was buried on the hillside above her home overlooking the valley, where she had arrived as a widow with nothing but a wagon, a set of tools, and a promise she had made to a dying man. Ansel maintained the home after her death. Their children grew up and moved to towns with railways and telegraph offices, and the kind of progress that draws young people away from mountains. Ansel stayed. He lived in the hillside home until his own death in 1903, 47 years after Nettie had swung the first pickaxe into the slope. He was buried beside her, and the two stones that marked their graves looked out over a valley that had been permanently changed by the woman who refused to build the way everyone else built. The home stood for another 17 years after Ansel's death, occupied by various families who passed through the valley during the region's mining era. Each family found the same thing Nettie had found. The structure stayed warm in winter without excessive firewood. It stayed cool in summer without ventilation. The drainage channels kept the interior dry through every storm. The stone wall stood plumb and true, its mortar cracked in places but its mass undiminished. In 1920, the last family moved out, not because the structure had failed, but because the valley's population had declined as mining opportunities drew people elsewhere. The home was abandoned to the mountain that had sheltered it for 64 years. Nature reclaimed it slowly and without malice. The sod roof continued growing season after season until wild grasses and small wildflowers covered it completely. The stone wall weathered to the color of the surrounding rock. The wooden door and window frames rotted and fell away, leaving dark openings that filled with drifted leaves and the nests of small animals. By the 1930s, a person walking the trail above could pass directly over the site without knowing that a home had existed there. The hillside had taken it back gently, the way a parent pulls a blanket over a sleeping child. But what Nettie Morley built did not disappear. It migrated outward in the hands of every person who had learned from her and from every person who learned from them. It lived in the homesteads scattered across Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, where families built into hillsides and survived winters that would have killed them otherwise. It lived in the building practices of a region that had once believed there was only one way to construct a shelter, and learned through ice and desperation and the quiet courage of a woman alone on a mountainside that there were other ways, better ways, ways that worked with the land instead of standing against it until the land won. Ward Morley told his wife on a frozen prairie with blood on his lips and his hand in hers to build smart, not just strong. Nettie did more than that. She built a way of living, and she taught an entire community that real knowledge is not afraid to stand alone, and that the truest measure of what you build is not whether it impresses the people watching, but whether it is still standing long after they have stopped.